Good day, and welcome to NPR News Presents Capturing History, our year covering the George Floyd story. I'm Sarah Glover, NPR News Managing Editor. The NPR News staff was recently recognized with the National Headliner Award and Regional Edward R. Murrow Award for its coverage of George Floyd's life and untimely death. The news and program teams distinguished themselves by bringing care, precision, and empathy to their news gathering and coverage. A jury found former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, a white man, guilty of murder and manslaughter on April 20th, 2021. Over the past year, local and national communities have voiced concerns about police brutality and called for new laws to protect citizens. NPR continues to tell the unfolding and developing aftermath of stories, as well as reporting law enforcement perspectives and the viewpoints of their supporters too. Floyd's killing and the sequences of events thereafter, which included numerous social protests in cities across the country and around the globe, brought transformative calls for racial justice. George Floyd Square at the corner of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis is the mecca for the modern day social justice movement. Minneapolis is forever etched in America's civil rights movement as the place where change took root this century and the renewed awakening for racial injustice was spawned as a result of Floyd's murder at the age of just 46 years old. Calls for racial equity unfolded due to the Cellphone video of Floyd's murder, and that was posted to social media by a teen witness to the crime. We understand the power of media and social media and do not take lightly the responsibility and impact that NPR News has on all the communities we serve. This is why we've brought together members of our news staff to discuss the coverage of George Floyd from the journalist's point of view. Our news team will share the challenges of news coverage during a global pandemic and provide some perspective on the community members that NPR reported on and gave a voice to. We want to give you, our audience, a peek behind the scenes at how we gather the news for a major riveting story like George Floyd's life and death. It's a story that is ongoing. NPR News is committed to continuing to shine a light and to cover the continued impact and progress on our local communities. We also want to hear from you and continue to dialogue with Minnesotans and beyond on our airwaves and online and social media. It's my distinct honor to introduce to you Cathy Wurzer, host of Morning Edition at NPR News. Cathy will lead this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Glover. Appreciate you doing that. That's a nice introduction. Let me welcome you to Minnesota Public Radio News and this special event, Capturing History, our year covering the George Floyd story. You know, when I tell people who don't know me what I do for a living, there's always a lot of questions about how I do what I do and why. Being a journalist, it means capturing moments, uncovering stories, getting answers, and verifying the facts with the aim of presenting stories that are fact-based and unbiased. And when you do this, you sometimes do it under very difficult circumstances as a journalist. What listeners don't get to see is how all of this happens. You're not a party to the behind-the-scenes conversations and the decisions made, especially with a fast-moving story like the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. So we thought it might be of value to talk about covering one of the biggest stories in Minnesota history with the award-winning team that did a lot of the work. So let me introduce them to you. Reporter Brandt Williams joins us. So does editor Laura Yuen and photojournalist Evan Frost. Good to see you all. Welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, hi, Cathy.
By the way, I like to invite our viewers, if you have a question, leave it in the comment section below the screen. Say, Brandt, when I got into work the morning after George Floyd died, it was about 3:30 in the morning, and I saw the official MPD news release of what happened. And then I saw the video, which was shared on social media by our colleague, Mukhtar Ibrahim. And I thought, you know, what is this? What am I seeing? Because it didn't connect with what the official story was, the official account. I'm trying to think of all the cases you've covered over so many years. Did it seem to you, even in the early going, that the George Floyd story was going to be different?
Yeah, and I had a similar experience, waking that morning, just a couple hours after you first saw it, seeing this press release, because I'm like most people, I check my phone before I get out of bed, and I'm looking and I see this, saying that there was a man who died after having a medical event or a medical emergency while in custody. There were no officers didn't fire their weapons, and there were no officers injured or anything like that. And a few hours later, then just seeing the video and just going, yeah, this is really not what happened, and this is going to be a big deal. And compared to other police-involved killings that I've seen in the past, this one just seemed that it was going to be a lot different. And the number one thing was this was not a split-second decision that an officer made to use force, because a lot of times we see these things happen. Officers has a firearm and somebody, they encounter somebody and maybe they think the person's holding a weapon or making a move and make a split-second decision. But it took so long. And we all saw George Floyd begging for his life and saying that he could not breathe. And I just think that after seeing that, so many people had this immediate response to take to the streets. And that's when I knew this story was going to be something a lot bigger than we've seen before.
So, Evan Frost is a photojournalist. You were one of the first to go out on the street to make images of what was happening. And I know you were at 38th in Chicago. Crowds were gathering there. Other journalists, especially some of our TV colleagues, said that they described a lot of grief and tension and anger, and many people didn't want to talk to other journalists. So I'm kind of curious, how did you build trust in order to get folks to talk to you, but also allow them the space to have these difficult emotions like grief and anger?
Yeah, I think that the grieving process is extremely complicated. The first thing to do is just to acknowledge that. And the day after George Floyd was killed, I remember I was supposed to have the day off, and I called my boss, Christine Yuen, and ended up going to 38th in Chicago at around 8 in the morning when there was just a bouquet of flowers and 2 or 3 people kind of standing around the spot where George Floyd was killed. And I think the most important part of that building trust is just showing up repeatedly and standing around and talking to people and not even having my camera on my shoulder. I would make it a priority to just introduce myself and to talk to people and ask them questions, ask them how they were feeling, and give people kind of an outlet for the emotions that they're feeling before I would try to gather something of their story, to kind of give them a space to process through me, and kind of build that trust. And the trust building, like I said, it's an ongoing process. And I think it really comes down to just showing up and to try to tell the story in a creative way too. Like one day, me and one of our freelance photographers, Kaden Heptas, showed up to George Floyd Square with a camera, a tripod, and a remote. And we let people just choose where they wanted to be photographed and then take their own picture, and just really finding ways to let the community kind of express themselves through our storytelling. And just showing up, and a lot of standing around and a lot of just talking to people and listening was the most important part for me.
How intense was it? Go ahead, Gloria.
I was going to say, I think Evan and Brandt both exemplify a really important trait for journalists who want to do this kind of work, and that's humility. I think sometimes you do see reporters who think they have all the answers, and they go into a situation and kind of just fill in the blanks and get the quotes that they need. But what I often see from Brandt and Evan is this willingness to share in the power of storytelling and being open-minded, and building that trust and deepening relationships, and then getting the story from there.
As an editor, Laura Yuen, you're behind the scenes. Can you tell us how you helped shape the story in the first few days?
The first few days were, it was just, everything was moving very, very fast. I remember, Cathy, you were talking to one of the reporters on my team, John Collins, right after one of the first, the first night of unrest. And he was observing, just the billowing smoke left over from the night's fires. And so that first week was just trying to keep up with the news and trying to, press for answers from the police department. And I remember by Saturday, after several nights of unrest, this is when the governor and other elected officials were going on to do press conference and talking about how some of the protesters, at least, were actually people from outstate or other parts of the country who were kind of using the protests as cover to wreak havoc. And I remember we were teaming up with our folks from the national side, APM reports, who are like investigative reporters from the national side, and we just went all out trying to figure out whether there was truth to those claims, and we did find evidence of that. But I remember after like a 12-hour shift, and we were still going and we're doing special coverage that night. I just remember John Collins, a reporter who lives in South Minneapolis, was saying, you know, okay, I think we have a good story here. But before I go on to, you know, our live show with Carrie Miller, I'm going to just hose down my house, because that's what a lot of folks in South Minneapolis were doing. You know, just protecting their homes from catching fire. I think about that a lot, you know, in terms of just how do we tell the story, not as the same way everyone who else might be parachuting in from other parts of the country, but how do we tell the story from people who live here and people who are concerned about what's happening to our police department and how our neighbors are being treated, and you know, people who live here and are dealing with some of the aftermath. So that's something that we always try to keep in mind is, yes, how is this changing and rippling around the country, but how is it also affecting how Minnesotans live, breathe, and think?
Evan Frost, as a photojournalist, you know, when you get yourself involved in something like the civil unrest that occurred in the day or two after George Floyd's death, how did you, that's intense. How did you cover that part of the story and keep yourself safe?
It is pretty intense. And it was a learning experience last year. That was my first time covering anything of that intensity. It's keeping yourself safe in the field is really about keeping your head on a swivel and knowing who you're with and knowing who you're surrounded by and knowing who you can rely on. And I'm really grateful that here in the Twin Cities, we have an absolutely amazing community of photographers and photojournalists. So you can turn your head at these things and you can see someone who you know will have your back and you know who will look out for you. But the most important part was really just like I said, building those relationships and knowing who you're with. And it's changed in my thinking about it and the way that I kind of act in these situations of civil unrest has changed in the last year. And I could tell that in our photo community here, so many people, when Dante Wright was killed and we saw the unrest after that, we're so much more prepared. We had gas masks, we had bulletproof vests, we had first aid kits, we had all the gear that maybe we didn't have last year. And this kind of mental preparation to know that police are going to use force. There's a crowd there that is fairly unpredictable, and trying to balance these things and stay in the middle and document history while also not getting yourself in a bad position. It's difficult, but I think it's really kind of just relying on each other and knowing your surroundings.
Brandt, I know that you've covered a number of protests again in your career, as have I, and I don't think I've ever had to wear a gas mask or have a bulletproof vest. You know, this was the first time that I've seen, as a veteran journalist, the police aggression against journalists. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I remember covering, I think some of the most significant protests I started covering was back in, excuse me, I think it was the early 2000s. There was a International Society of Animal Geneticists having a conference, and there was a lot of protests downtown. And for the most part, the police just kept a distance. They made sure people stayed on the sidewalk and they marched around. I think there were a couple skirmishes, but no widespread arrests or clashes. And throughout the years, they started to continue to use that particular tactic of just keeping people on the streets and sidewalks, not telling them to leave, not telling them to disperse. But this was different. I was not out during the after dark, the type of unrest we'd see after dark. I mostly covered the daytime protests following George Floyd's killing. So, but it was very different just seeing the types of images that I saw. And I just wonder if there was a level of fear that the officers were experiencing that caused them to react in a certain way that we had not seen before. I don't know if that was something that they were being told to do, if it was the infusion of National Guard troops being eventually coming out, and the type of equipment that they were using. So I don't know. There's a lot of different elements, I think, that kind of led to that escalation, but I had not seen that level of police response in the past protests that I'd covered.
Yeah.
So if you just go ahead, Evan.
Just to add on to that too, it's I had never seen anything like that either, and it seemed not to matter that you were at points that you were a clearly identified member of the press. When police are standing on top of a 3-story building, as at the 3rd precinct or at Brooklyn Center, and shooting less lethal rounds, rubber bullets, or whatever you may call them, at people, it didn't seem to matter who you were or where you were. Like you were at risk. I was near a colleague at the Star Tribune, Mark Van Cleve, who was shot in the hand and had 2 fingers broken. Another colleague I was with, Tim Evans, when police cleared out an area, was tackled and pressed into the ground by a police officer, even though he was clearly identified as press. It didn't seem like there was any kind of structure to it, and it made the situation a lot more dynamic and a bit scary at times too.
We have a listener question here. This is for Brandt. And by the way, if you have a question for our panelists, Brandt Williams is with us, Evan Frost, and Laura Yuen, and we're talking about the NPR News coverage of the George Floyd story. Brandt, this is to you. Had there been no video at all, how would this story have been covered? Would the media simply have taken that initial report coming from the MPD?
Well, it would have been a lot different. I don't think we would have seen the amount of public outcry as quickly as we did with this case. This would have been one that would have been, you would get the press release from the police department, and there would be probably a much slower, a slow drip of information that would come out after that. You know, it takes more resources. You're going to have reporters down on the scene and talking to people who saw what happened. And even if anybody didn't record it, you'd still have eyewitnesses to talk to. But you know, in covering the story, I was reminded of conversations that I'd had with people who had experienced daily occurrences of police brutality in their neighborhoods, none of which had been covered by somebody with a camera. They would just say, you know, we see things happening every day, or frequently, that wouldn't necessarily rise to the level of a national scandal, but just little everyday slights. Officers using foul language in front of children, in cursing somebody out, or treating somebody roughly. Those are the types of things, the everyday occurrences that people would talk about and say, you know, you guys don't cover this type of thing. So in this case of George Floyd, everything just came together with that video. And of course, when when it's time for the trial, that's exactly what the prosecution relied on. This was what you saw was what happened. And but it would have been a lot. I think the reaction would have been slower, not nearly as intense, if this had not been filmed and then put out on social media.
Say, Laura, historically, journalists have accepted as gospel the police narrative of what happened in a situation because they're the authorities, right? We have a question from our friend Charles Hallman from the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder newspaper. He says, a year later, how much has the George Floyd death moved media coverage of police shootings forward, including not accepting police reports at first glance?
I mean, I think it's definitely an ongoing conversation. It's just really pushed this one to the forefront. I mean, even before the murder of George Floyd, we had been talking about this, the need to corroborate information. So, because this isn't the first time that a police account has been very misleading. I'm reminded of a couple years ago when we had what was called the Truth and Transformation Conference, and NPR was one of the partners who hosted this, where we brought in community members to have a dialogue with journalists. And one thing that we heard was this complaint. I'd say is probably the biggest one that we heard, is just going with the first draft of that press release of what the police put out. And I remember hearing from a young woman who was from a Hmong American family, and her brother had died some kind of violent death, and was described by police as fallen victim to some kind of gang-related shooting. And she said that her brother actually wasn't part of a gang. And to have this be kind of the last word on who her brother was as a person was very traumatic for her. And NPR sent some top editors to that conference. I think just having those editors hear firsthand just the harm that we can do when we perpetuate untruths or misstatements from authorities, it shook them so much that they decided right then and there that we weren't going to go with that term gang related if we hadn't done the extra reporting to corroborate that. So I think that with the Floyd killing, I think we are seeing much more desire and impetus from journalists from all organizations to just beef up the reporting. I don't know if there's any one policy, though, that says that any newsroom has actually carried to that says they'll prevent from reporting on, a shooting or something like that until they get more.
I think it's difficult to, I mean, when there's breaking news, something has just happened. And usually it's, unless you were there yourself, or you're watching a scanner and have a reporter who can arrive to the scene of something before there's a press release that comes out. Generally, the practice has been, you get a press release from the police department saying that there was, an officer involved incident and somebody was dead. And a lot of times their press releases are very vague because they will have to talk to an officer or a sergeant on the scene to get information on, to get a version out there. And so I don't know what happened with this particular press release with George Floyd's killing. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that, yes, we're trying to balance between getting something out there quickly and, of course, have it be accurate. And sometimes, the police information is quick, but, so maybe it's going to be a point of in the future having, saying that, we're getting reports about an incident involving a police officer. They have released a press statement that we're working on verifying, and we'll bring you the information as soon as we can verify it. Maybe it's a matter of that, but I don't know if the public is willing to, if folks are going to be patient enough to wait for us to get somebody down there and get the type of corroboration that we'll need. But we're in new territory now. Just I think this is our newsroom and others are really going to have to pay attention to the type of information that you get from police departments and how quickly you want to get information out there.
What does it mean then that there was that move after this whole thing occurred where the response was to transfer the MPD communications office into the city's kind of more general communications department? What do you make of that? Do you have any specific thoughts on that, Laura Yuen or Brandt Williams or Evan Frost?
Well, I'll just say that I remember when that went through, when they were debating that, the city council was covering that. And it turns out that didn't take. The last I heard, they were having a hard time moving that position in under the city communications department because of dealing with overtime issues and the way that the hours that police information officer has to basically be on staff for. So I don't think that quite worked, but the sentiment was basically we need to have more coordinated communications between the police and the city needs to have one voice when it comes to getting this information out. And it was directly tied to that initial press release from George Floyd's killing.
Say, Laura, you kind of mentioned this a little bit early in the conversation about the national context for this story, right? And we're covering the story for the world, but we're also covering it for our neighbors. And I'm wondering, how did you as an editor define your mission within that national context? And then maybe I'd like to hear from Evan and then Brandt on that same story, that same question.
I mean, this is we acknowledge this is probably the story of our lifetime, so and it's a story that everybody in the world was following. So sometimes I did struggle personally, to be honest with you. It's like, how can we differentiate ourselves from all of these top caliber reporters who were coming in from all corners of the country. And I think we just realized that we needed to, we have a Minnesota audience, and so that was our main focus. Throughout the in the days following the killing to all the way up to the trial, it was really just about what does our audience need to know about what happened in the Chauvin trial today. So making sure that our newscasts were full with the highlights of, or the key moments of what happened that day in court, to making sure our website was populated with explainers. What are the charges again? What do you need to know? Who are the main players at the trial? Those kind of things, as we were getting ready for jury selection. What is jury selection? I mean, what was so fascinating is we actually opened up, our digital team, who's in charge of engagement, opened up questions to the audience. And sometimes we think in our newsrooms that we have like this infinite wisdom of what the audience really wants to know. But I think what was so interesting about this trial is, because it was live streamed, which was the first time in Minnesota history we'd been able to see a criminal trial like this televised from gavel to gavel, people were learning about the criminal justice process, the legal process. So just even understanding about, how juries are selected was a very critical public service to provide people with. And I think also what was just helpful for me to remind myself was, yes, people could have watched this trial anywhere because it was live streamed, but I mean, there's a reason why some people are coming to us, and that's because they, this is an organization that they had a relationship with, because they trusted us, because we had some kind of credibility, and that helped me just kind of feel pretty affirmed about the service we were providing.
As a host, also, I'll say this, listening to our colleagues, Carrie Miller and Angela Davis, conduct really civil conversations on the air. And also, I have to give kudos to our social media team. I mean, they were really moderating a lot of potentially explosive conversations online and did a really good job with that.
Absolutely. I think, maybe 10 years ago, there was a thinking like, well, you can't have a conversation that's this volatile, because it's going to just invite all these trolls. And, but I think what this exercise showed us is you can, as long as you invest in the resources. So Sarah Porter is the digital producer whose main job it was to facilitate these conversations. And from what I understand, there wasn't a lot of trolling going on, but there were a few people who were coming here for the wrong reasons, to spew hateful comments and racist comments and that kind of thing. So once those people were muted or banned, I mean, it largely was a civil conversation, and that's because it was all by design to have to make sure that it was a safer space than most.
So, Evan, I don't want you to be out of the conversation here. How did you see your role as a photojournalist within this greater, larger national context?
I love my role as a photojournalist here, because it's like, unlike reporters, I'm not breaking news. I'm not like bringing like new information to the table. But what I can do is I can introduce you to the community. And that's the part I love, is I get to stand around and I get to meet people, and I get to see how every individual at these things has the most fascinating life story, and just try to connect people with the characters who are involved in this movement, whether it's Jeanette Rupert, this amazing minister and nurse who is working in a COVID ICU unit and running an emergency medical program at George Floyd Square, or her sister, Janelle Austin, who's working to preserve all of the artwork that is just left around the site where George Floyd was killed. Just being able to, like, yeah, I can go out and take pictures of a burning building and riots, but afterwards, it's like, when it's quiet, like, what is still happening? What is going on? And the momentum of this movement, how different people are like supporting it from all different ways. It's just fascinating. I mean, I love talking to strangers in the first place, and now I get to have this window into their lives. And I think one thing that we did really well, especially my colleague Megan Burks and Christine Yuen, is they brought in students from South High School, and they were all part of this class. And these groups of students would go to George Floyd Square and they would find one of these stories. They would find a story about Janelle Austin, or I'm blank on the name, but the man who painted the famous mural of the black and white mural of George Floyd, and just introduce all of us to all of these players in the community and really connect people to what it means to be part of the movement.
Brandt, what was it like? Now I'm talking about the trial at this point. What was it like to bear witness and report on the historic nature of the Derek Chauvin trial?
Well, it was unlike any trial I'd ever covered, and I covered a bit. Number one, because with the COVID restrictions being so that we could only have a couple pool reporters in the courtroom at a time. There was no gallery of spectators. The jurors were all spread apart in one side of the room. And it struck me because given the gravity of this particular case, you would expect that there would be a large, a full gallery, and with family members of George Floyd. You may even have supporters of Derek Chauvin in the courtroom. And in the past, I've covered trials that involved someone being either assaulted or killed. And so you've got this energy in the room where, when that person who is the defendant, who is facing these charges, is either brought in an orange jumpsuit or, walks in with their lawyer in a suit and tie, that the energy changes. People are looking, intently at the defendant, and there's, you see the jurors, reactions to all the interaction going on in the gallery as well, because they can be affected by how people in the gallery respond to certain kinds of testimony. So that part was very strange. But I had covered some other trials involving Minneapolis police officers who were accused of committing crimes while on the job. And some of those trials involved having police officers testify unwillingly against one of their colleagues. In those trials in particular, it was an officer named Christopher Ryder who was eventually convicted of assaulting a man who was on his knees in police custody by kicking him in the face. Some of his fellow officers at the scene were called to testify, and they were very uncomfortable. And there was a bit of testimony that was a bit suspect, and that prosecutors maybe not directly inferred that some of these officers were not being entirely truthful. And fast forward to the George Floyd trial, when you have members of the Minneapolis Police Department testifying pretty, I wouldn't say enthusiastically, but they're pretty directly testifying against Derek Chauvin, their former colleague, and saying that what he did violated not only the training that officers receive, but also the values that police officers should live by. So that was very different.
We have a question from a listener, and this is from Mahmoud, and this is to Laura Yuen. My question, Laura: there were many immigrants who felt traumatized, as many of us are coming from Civil War unrest. How is the media bringing a sense of calmness while covering these tragic moments? It was just so much pain, physically and emotionally, over what happened last year.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think I've seen some really good reporting out of Sahan Journal, one of our partners, about how some of the unrest has affected refugee communities who, had actually fled some of the volatile situations back in the homeland. But also, if you're, for example, like a Black immigrant from East Africa, just also dealing with the layers of experiencing racism in this country too. I think the question was how
is the media trying to bring a sense of calmness while covering these tragic moments? Perhaps, wonder if this is also a personal question. As you know, journalists were supposed to just suck it up and go, but I wonder too, what was it like to cover such a traumatic story, and how are you helping your reporters through it? to bring that
Yeah.
sense of calm, perhaps,
Yeah. I think one thing that was really illuminating for me was the fact that this was allowed to be live streamed. So usually if I were editing back in the office in a non-COVID era, I would just be able to hear snippets from what the reporters tell me. But during this whole trial, the 6 or 7 weeks where we were able to, observe jury selection and also the most emotional parts, parts of the testimony, I really had a newfound respect for what our reporters have to go through day in, day out, because everyone who saw that video of George Floyd taking his last breaths under Derek Chauvin's knee had to have been rattled and traumatized to some extent. But seeing it from every different angle, the way it was shown at trial, from various body camera angles, from security angles, and from hearing the pain and anguish in every eyewitness's account, there were some very heavy days, and I don't know if I did the best job of processing that. I think it's and Brandt can speak to this too. I know, because we've had conversations about this as well. I mean, it's not something that we actively seek to watch these hard videos. But it was an important moment, and I felt like all of us felt like we needed to rise in this moment and cover that and explain what this means for our state, what it means for our neighbors, for law enforcement, for Black and Brown communities across this country. I think in some ways there's a lot to be said about self-care for journalists too, because it isn't easy. I think those are conversations that we continue to have with reporters and others on the front lines, checking in, frequent check-ins, making sure that they are taking some time off when they need to, even encouraging time off when they're not volunteering for it, because it is a very difficult job to do day in, day out. One thing I learned at one point from, I think it was the DART Center, was an instructor the DART Center is, they equip journalists with skills to report on trauma. And I heard one of the instructors say that sometimes having a sense of humor is a good sign of resilience. So if I know one of my reporters is, just making a wisecrack about, whatever is happening on a Zoom call with him or her, I know that's a good sign that that they're being resilient through all of this.
Brandt or Evan, do you want to weigh in on just the ways you might have dealt with your own emotions surrounding this whole story?
I did take time off eventually, and and try to disconnect for a bit. It was difficult during the trial, I'll just say, just because the way we had our days structured, I'd usually start early in the morning, like around 6 o'clock, and work into the afternoon, and then try to disconnect for a little bit in the afternoons. But that wasn't always possible because there's still testimony going on. And so I'd want to be just have my own sense of what was going on then. So there were times when it was hard to disconnect a bit, but I'm generally pretty good about I can compartmentalize these types of things, and it's just from a lot of the coverage that I've done since I've been on the crime and public safety beat for over 20 years in. So there are pretty awful things that you have to see and read about on a regular basis. So I've learned how to compartmentalize, think of myself as actually an emergency responder in some ways, like an EMT who comes to the scene of a car crash and can just concentrate on doing the job first, get people the help they need, and then leave and put that behind them as best they can. And that's kind of how I've kind of approached my beat over the years is, in the face of something that looks really, really awful and something really terrible happened, and you're talking to people who've experienced the worst event in their life by losing a loved one or, experiencing being a victim of a crime. I just try my best to compartmentalize that as part of the job. And then when I'm off, I'm off. I'm not looking at somebody else's video posted of another incident somewhere in another state. I'm not doing that.
Evan, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, it's a pretty huge question, just because there's so many aspects of it. And I'm lucky and grateful. I just got back from a week off here. But it can be, as journalists, and I think especially photojournalists, is we're always working on someone else's schedule. So it can be really hard to sign off for the day when maybe the best photo is going to happen later that evening. So having that time off, whether it be a weekend or a day or whenever you can, to just like, I turn off my cell phone is the thing. Is I need to intentionally like leave it in my car, and I'm going to put this away from me so I don't check it. When it comes to like the more intense coverage of civil unrest, is I found just being prepared. Like Brandt was saying about being an EMT, I actually just got done training as an EMT. So just knowing that I can show up at these things and I can be there. And if something went sideways, I could be more than someone taking pictures. And that brings me a lot of peace of mind as well. It's just being prepared and ready. And on the more kind of simple side of things is just eating healthy and trying to find some exercise and doing things that are just good for your mental health. I think that gives yourself a good foundation, because it never stops.
No, it never stops. It never stops. It bears mentioning that, of course, all this happened during a pandemic. And, I joke about, I've been doing morning edition sometimes out of the closet of my bedroom. Who knew that this was going to happen? And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, such a big story. And yet it occurred during a time where, we had social distancing and mask wearing. And Laura, I know you're the mom of two little kids. School shut down. You're trying to edit stories, and you don't. And there's not the audio we normally have, the scene tape, for stories. How did you maneuver that?
I did hire a nanny last summer because I knew it wouldn't be sustainable once we got through the spring with schools closed, daycares closed. So yeah, a couple people on my team, other reporters, are in the same situation. They're parents of little kids, and it is hard because I think a lot of reporters got into radio storytelling because of the in-person experience, because the power of the human voice is so compelling when you can go look someone in the eye, capture their voice, not over phone, but like right there in person, and build a scene, not even with words necessarily, but with sounds. The sounds kind of evoke a picture. That's just the reason why a lot of radio reporters get up in the morning. And I think they missed out on that too. And now that they're vaccinated, they're just being able to get back into that. And it's been kind of exhilarating, I think, for some of them. But yeah, it was a rough go. And also around that time, the spring when Floyd was killed, we also had a number of people leave the newsroom because of some buyouts as well. So it was a very difficult period in time for our newsroom, for sure.
Hey, Cathy, can I just add to that?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to put on something that Laura said about the impact of the pandemic, as well as I think that also intensified the response to what we all saw. People couldn't go back to their normal lives. People were, I think, basically in a position where they could focus on this a lot more intensely than they would had there not been a pandemic, and people could still go out and carry on their lives as if would see the video and say, oh, that's really awful, that's really terrible, but I got to go back to work on Monday, or I've got this going on, I got to get my kids to school. This all happened at a time when we were all isolating, and I think as the pandemic showed us, there are so many other parts of our society that were particularly vulnerable to what was going on with this terrible disease, that I think that also inspired people to think of how things are going to be different at some point. And I think that inspired a lot of people who had maybe not thought about the types of changes that could be made to policing to prevent this from happening again, started getting the idea that, we're going to have to redo a lot of this stuff, the way we go to work, the way we go to school, how we get our food these days. So why not making big changes in the way public safety is delivered? And so I think all that is a part of, I think the pandemic had much more of an impact on the response to George Floyd's killing as well.
Hey, thanks for mentioning change here, because I'm going to go ahead and make a quick turn. But first, I want to hear from Evan Frost, because, again, being the photojournalist, you folks are always on the front line. And there you were in a pandemic out in front of the governor's mansion with folks who did not want to wear masks. And you kind of put yourself in danger there several times. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what that was like?
Well, the first rule of being a photojournalist is you got to be there. And I got to say, like, for Laura and other parents in our newsroom and other parents who work as journalists, I have just an incredible amount of respect for how much people have been juggling throughout this pandemic. Like, I'm 27, live by myself, and am pretty healthy. And when George Floyd happened and when COVID started happening, and we're watching history happen in front of us. It's like, yes, I could wear my mask, I could wear my N95, but I got to show up. I can't not be there. And when the anti-mask protests started happening outside the governor's mansion, I would have this debate with our weekend editor. They would always have it on Saturday with our weekend editor, Andrew Krieger, is like, is it worth it? How far away can I stand? Like, what is, you gotta think about the value added of showing up and being there and being close. And it was pretty nerve wracking. And especially when George Floyd was killed, it, like, that kind of went out the window. It was just like, yeah, you just have to kind of put the rest of the side and show up.
Right.
And you did. You all did. Let's talk about change here, Laura, Yuen, and then please, Brandt and Evan, chime in. Obviously, you know, with the killing of George Floyd, that really led to newsrooms around the country kind of having their own racial reckoning. And I want to know from you, Laura, tell us a little bit about what NPR is doing specifically in the newsroom on diversifying staff, coverage, equipping journalists with the skills that they're going to need to report on race and inequality. There are several things that are happening, and I'd like to have you run that down for our audience.
Yeah, sure. You know, interestingly, when George Floyd was killed, that same week was going to be our inaugural meeting for our new diversity committee, our DEI committee. And we actually wondered if we should go through with it because, like I said, it was just everyone was completely strapped, just trying to do our very best to cover this monumental story. But we also had the thought, if, you know, there's actually no better time to have our first meeting. So what that committee did is we came up with just some priorities on ways we could improve the culture here in our newsroom and make it more welcoming, and also, of course, improve the coverage, because that's, you know, that is what we do. And so that committee came up with some priorities like source diversity tracking. So starting a few months ago, one of our senior leaders in the newsroom has helped spearhead this process where reporters and producers are keeping track of, you know, just basic demographic information. When they are interviewing folks, they'll ask them, you know, can I just ask you some personal questions? Because we want to see if we're really living up to our values, because we want our airwaves and we want our digital content to look and sound like the demographics of the state. So until we actually track that data, we're never going to know. So our goal is to, you know, get greater participation in it, and then hopefully be able to see how far are we from actually reflecting, you know, the demographics of our state. We're also have another committee that's in charge of onboarding. So when there's a new hire coming to NPR News, like, what can we do to make that initial period much more smoother than it has been in the past. Things just like assigning a mentor, for example, or just making sure that, you know, someone is continually checking in on them who might not be in a supervisory role. The other big thing that we're doing right now is just this rollout of our ethics guidelines. And in fact, we just had a big meeting on Friday. This is company-wide all throughout American Public Media Group. And we hired a couple of consultants who are experts on covering race and inequality to help guide our newsroom through a draft of new guidelines that will help reporters and other journalists determine, okay, how do I cover this issue through the lens of race and gender? So like sexual harassment, how do I still make sure that I'm upholding, you know, sound journalistic guidelines when it comes to investigating these things, but also being sensitive and taking care with sources, including survivors of sexual harassment. So we're just beginning to kick that off, and we'll have a series of trainings throughout the next 6 months.
Also, I know we're talking about cultural fluency. Can you explain that?
Yeah, we just had that actually last week too. So we've been very busy at NPR News because we have a lot of work to do. You know, we absolutely do. And I think people are excited about this because like I said, within the past few years, I think even before the killing of George Floyd, I think there's been just a growing awareness among journalists in this field that there's no such thing as like objectivity, but we can be aware of our own biases and how they may be creeping into our work and how we're covering certain communities. So just last week, we had our in-house DEI expert, Nam Provost, kind of walk us through some small group exercises and just to try to think about like how we identify and just be more conscious of that. And I think we'll see a lot more exciting things on that end too.
You know, Brandt, as I've stated so many times, you and I have been together in this newsroom for many, many years. Right. Do you see some of these changes manifesting?
Yeah, although I haven't been in the newsroom in a long time.
True.
But yes, things have changed. I can say things have changed a lot since I started back in, I think it's 21 years ago. I was the first African-American man hired as a reporter at NPR back then. And I have seen a few more wide variety of folks coming into the newsroom. And I think what's really important, as well as what Laura was talking about when it comes to cultural fluency, I can't stress enough that even though I'm an African-American and I come from, that cultural background, it does not necessarily mean that I am any more fluent in what happens in the lives of Asian American, Latinx, Native American folks in their experiences. And so I think we all have to, it's a matter of, looking at yourself as your personal limitations, biases, experiences, and how they shape how you look at things and how you report on them. And I just think that, I think it's important for all of us to kind of keep in mind where we're coming from and how, maybe the things that we grew up and experienced have shaped the way we look at other communities and experiences. And so I think that's important work that to keep doing. And I think it's something that's especially important now.
Evan, do you have anything to add?
Oh, I just 100% agree with what Brandt says. It's just coming into every single situation and assuming that I know nothing about it and that I don't understand anyone else's experience, but I can ask a lot of good questions. And with our photography, the gaze, that's the term, is the kind of what gaze do we bring on things? And traditional photojournalism has often been the white male gaze, and how people see the world, and trying to bring in other photographers into our freelance rotation who see the world differently than I do, and to go out and be capable to tell these stories. And I just think that that's really important.
Evan, you want to talk about change makers since that's ongoing?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we have this recurring series that we've done for Black History Month, Indigenous Heritage Month, and Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, where we highlight different people in the community who are making positive change with a portrait and a transcribed interview, basically asking them what is important in their community, who do they see as making positive change, and what's their vision for the future, and just kind of giving these different communities a platform to kind of speak their truth and like their vision for the future. And that's been a really fulfilling project at the latest iteration we're working on with Sahan Journal.
We have about 4 minutes left. And so I'm going to ask this question to all of you. I feel that if you allow it, that sometimes stories can change you a little bit. Again, if you allow it. And I never liked admitting that when I was on the street as a reporter, but I think it's true. And I'm wondering whether you all have changed in the past year and how, if you want to share with everybody. And since, Evan, you were the last person to speak, I'll give you this question first.
I mean, it's changed. I feel like me and everyone in a lot of complicated ways. I think that I've just personally become a little more sure of myself as a journalist, and in that, knowing that I can show up to a situation and I could listen really well, and I can connect with people, and I can give people a space where I can be receptive to whatever they have to say, and I can give them someone trusted to talk to. I'm not sure if that totally answers the question. It's just made me understand grief in a different way too. That grief is not something that is experienced by an individual in certain stages. Grief is messy. Grief is experienced as a community and a society, and it's something that we can't necessarily quantify. We can just do our best to kind of relay the experiences of individuals and help people connect with one another and see how other people are feeling. And it just helped me realize that, like, we're never going to tell the whole story, but we can do our best to really show people how to connect with others.
Laura Yuen?
I want to go back to something Evan said earlier, just about being the news organization that looks to uplift people in the community who are doing amazing things. And, I think this newsroom has been working very hard in telling those stories. Reham Fashir, another reporter here, is coming out with a story today on Jerry Blackwell, one of the main prosecutors who helped convict Derek Chauvin. And really using that framework of who's rising in the moment, I think is a good one, because there are a lot of just amazing stories out there. On a personal note, I mean, I don't know if it's covering the story, but just, bearing witness to this awful tragedy. I just will never forget, a year ago when my 7-year-old was watching the news and saw a clip of George Floyd pleading for air under Derek Chauvin's knee, and him just asking, why is this officer doing that? And I think it really forced me to just be even more explicit about race and racism. And even at his young age, I want him to see it. I want him to see it, and I want him not to be afraid to talk about it, because I think we as a state and as a nation need to be moving in that direction.
Brandt Williams, have you changed in this past year?
I'll tell you, it's perhaps kind of aged me a bit in that I have become more careful about how I report on in my beat, because I've been doing it for so long, and I do have a lot of experience, but that can also be a liability, and that you can get too caught up in covering the same thing over and over because you're so used to a narrative being one way. So I think it was helpful for me to just speak to more young folks who are coming out and have a lot of different ideas about the relationship they see between the police and the community. And so many of the stories I've done over the years have been about how people have wanted to see improvements to policing or reforms to policing, and that was their big push. But over the last year, there's been so much more emphasis on actually eliminating policing as we know it, and people imagining all these different ways that you could have public safety, some type of service that can respond to certain situations that don't involve armed police officers. Now, if you'd have told me that 5 years ago that people on a city council would be seriously considering that, I thought you were crazy. But it's become a lot more mainstreamed, and I think as my reporting, I'm trying to keep learning and evolving as a human, and just incorporating that into the realms of possibility, and not dismissing people who espouse this as being on some part of fringe. It seems to have moved more into more mainstream than it had in the past. So I try to keep all that in mind as I do my job, and as I get to be a senior journalist. It's like things change, you got to change with the times.
Agreed. Laura, all of our reporting's on our website, yes?
Yes, if you go to George Floyd 1 year later, you'll see a collection page with all of our reporting from over the year, and that will continue to populate that with special coverage this week for the anniversary.
So we know that journalism and reporting is both a passion and a duty. And I'm going to tell you, you three really underscore that with your work. I'm really proud of all of you. So thank you, Laura Yuen and Brandt Williams and Evan Frost. It's been an honor working alongside all three of you the past year. Thank you.
Likewise.
Yeah,
Thanks, Cathy.
And of course, we do this work here at NPR News because we want you to have the facts, verified and reliable, unbiased and undeniable. That's why we're here. And thank you for supporting our efforts. To read and listen again to NPR's ongoing George Floyd news coverage, you can visit us online, nprnews.org, on our mobile app, of course, and on social media. You can always listen, of course, NPR News 91.1 FM on your smart speakers and your preferred podcast channels. I'm Cathy Wurzer. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon.